The Terrible Red Racer by Lily Burgess. Girls, do you remember how I had to repeat Year 6? Asked Dad. Jasmine and Stephanie both nodded. Then Jasmine asked, "Is this the big rusty nail story?" "No," said Dad. "This is the story about how I broke my arm." "But Dad," said Stephanie, "didn't you break both your arms in Year 6? "At the same time?" screeched Jasmine. "No," said Dad. "Fortunately, not at the same time. I broke my right arm, and then a few weeks after it healed and the plaster came off, I broke my left arm." "Then all you did was play lemonade stand on the Apple II computer," laughed Stephanie. "That is right, Stephanie. At school, all I did was play lemonade stand for 6 months because I agreed to ride the Terrible Red Racer." "The Terrible Red Racer!" Stephanie and Jasmine yelled in unison as Mum rolled her eyes. Dad lowered his voice to a whisper. "Yes, the Terrible Red Racer." "I did not know that you had a red racing bike, Dad," said Jasmine. "I did not," said Dad. Then he lowered his voice. "That was part of the problem." Mum rolled her eyes again. "You see, Jasmine, I lent my yellow BMX bike to one of my best friends in primary school, Jeremy Tobin. Jeremy and I used to play together all the time. We mainly used to play at his house because he had so many toys. He was the first person at our school to get a Commodore 64 computer." "A what?" asked Jasmine. "Were they cool?" interrupted Stephanie. "A Commodore 64 was like an Xbox or Wii, Jasmine, and they were more than cool, Stephanie," said Dad. "At the time, they were totally awesome." Unfortunately, to load up a simple game like Ping, it took about half an hour because the game was loaded onto the computer with a cassette tape. "Dad, what is a cassette tape?" Jasmine asked. "Yes, Matthew, explain that one," Mum giggled. Mused Dad. "Perhaps the kids can Google it later." "Get on with the story, Dad," said Stephanie. "All right," said Dad. "On this particular day, near the beginning of the term for Year 6, we had a student-free day. Do you girls know what that means?" "Yes," exclaimed Jasmine. "It means that the kids get to stay home while the teachers have to go to school." "Exactly," said Dad. "But on this particular day, our soccer teacher offered to have a practice session when we would normally have big lunch. I stayed at home all morning, and then around the middle of the day, I rode my BMX bike to Jeremy's house. That way, we could ride to soccer practice together. When I got to Jeremy's house, he showed me the brand new red racing bike he had been given for his birthday. It was a very big bike, so big that Jeremy needed to give me a boost up to get on it. It was the right size for Jeremy because he was taller than me, but for some reason that to this day I am unsure of, Jeremy said that he really wanted to ride my yellow BMX bike. He asked me to ride his brand new red racer. While the red racer looked much like any other bike, there was one part of it that was very different. It had a triangular-shaped, grey-covered case that sat on the joint between the main frame of the bike and the handlebars, and it had 3 big red buttons on it, as well as a key. "What was it for?" asked Stephanie. "I asked the same thing of Jeremy," said Dad. "Jeremy explained to me that it was a special new invention that allowed you to lock the bike without the need of a chain." "How did that work exactly, Dad?" asked Jasmine. "Not very well," frowned Dad, as Mum giggled in the background. "Basically, what the invention was designed to do was to lock the handlebars in place so that they could not be moved in any direction. And, for reasons that you will hear about shortly, it was an idea that did not gain much popularity. Jeremy gave me a boost up onto the red racer. Then he jumped onto my yellow BMX, yelling, "Bet I can beat you there, Burjo!" Then he raced off down the street. Jeremy had a 50-metre lead before I got going. There were 2 ways to ride to school, on the bike track and through a tunnel, or on the road with the cars. By the time I got to the end of the street to turn onto the bicycle track, I could see Jeremy was already in the tunnel that went under the bridge near our school. I knew that the tunnel came out quite a long way away from where we were to meet for soccer. To have any chance at winning the race, I decided it would be quicker to cross the road in front of the school using the zebra crossing. Unfortunately, while the decision seemed smart at first, it soon proved to be wrong. As I came towards the zebra crossing, I saw a car coming down the street. Instead of going straight across the road, I needed to turn left and continue along the footpath to stay away from the approaching car. Dad paled. Guess what happened when I tried to turn left? "I know," giggled Stephanie. "What?" Jasmine asked with a worried voice. "The handlebars locked! Outrageous!" Stephanie shouted, then rolled about laughing. "Thanks, Stephanie," said Dad. The whiz-bang new invention of locking handlebars somehow locked without the key. So instead of the bike turning left, it continued going straight ahead. To make matters worse, there was a big bump on the path that caused me to ride straight over the gutter and onto the road at the exact time the car was approaching. At this stage, all I could think was that I had to try to get off the road before the car hit me. So I tried to jump off the terrible red racer, but my leg got caught in the handlebars that were still locked tight. Then I fell very quickly towards the road. By now, the lady driving the car had seen me. She slammed her brakes so hard that the car made a screeching sound that was even louder than the horn that she started beeping. As I fell to the ground, my body twisted. I then thought I had better push myself off the road as quickly as possible, so I put my right arm straight out to give me something to push off from. Guess what happened when my hand hit the road? "What, Dad?" gasped Jasmine, looking concerned. Dad paused for a minute and then stood up. Suddenly, he clapped his hands very loudly and yelled, "Snap!" Jasmine and Stephanie both jumped. "Snap!" squealed Jasmine. "Yes," said Dad, paling further. The bone in my right forearm snapped. It was like breaking a chopstick over your knee. Then I looked up. I was lying underneath the front of the car, which had come to a stop. I rolled out, and the lady was standing over me and screaming, "Move that bike! Get off the road!" I tried to stand up, but my right arm felt as though it weighed 1,000 million kilograms. I gasped. "I am moving as fast as I can. I think I have dislocated my shoulder." The lady continued yelling at me, "Move that bike! Get off the road!" "Dad, I thought you broke your arm," interrupted Stephanie. "Yes, I did break my arm, but I did not realize it at first," said Dad. I looked down at my arm and I noticed that the bone was sticking out at right angles. I then realized that I had probably not dislocated my shoulder. However, I was not entirely sure what had happened. The lady driving the car was still yelling at me as she drove off. While I was upset with her at the time, the reality was that I had been pretty irresponsible and had probably scared her more than I had scared myself. To this day, I still do not know how I managed to move Jeremy's terrible red racer off the road. Somehow, I dragged it all the way to the front door of the school office, which was about 150 metres away. There was no way I could ride the bike anymore. In fact, I could barely walk. I went to the front desk of the school and asked the lady at reception if I could phone my mum because I had hurt my arm. "Why didn't you just use your iPhone, Dad?" asked Stephanie. "Stephanie," said Dad, "there were no such things as mobile phones, let alone smartphones, when I was at school. In fact, we had only one cassette player in our whole family for many, many years." "Now that is really outrageous. Please stop talking about cassettes and get on with the story, Dad," demanded Stephanie. "Okay. The point was that unless I could convince the lady at the school to let me use the school's phone, there was no way I was going to be able to get in contact with my mum," Dad continued. The lady on reception looked at my arm. Then she looked at me and frowned and said, "It is a student-free day today, and no students are allowed inside the school. Please leave." Again, I showed the lady my arm and said, "Please, I am in a lot of pain." She then said, "No students are allowed in the school. Leave the building immediately." She held my left arm and marched me out of the office, and I went out onto the front lawn of the school. Then I lay down to save some energy and tried to think about what I could do next. After a little while, I decided that I needed to go back into the school and plead with the lady to allow me to make one quick phone call to my mum. While holding my arm, I slowly struggled to my feet. Just as I got to the front door, the lady jumped up from her desk, ran over, slammed the door shut, and then locked it so that I could not get in. Then she yelled through the window, "Go away! You are not welcome! Go away!" By now, I had lost all my energy. I collapsed on the front lawn of the school and just lay there, unable to move. I am still not sure how long I lay there, but at some stage later in the day, guess who came along? "Our mum?" guessed Jasmine. "Mum and Dad had not met yet, Jasmine," said Dad, smiling. "Who was it, Dad?" asked Jasmine. "My mum," said Dad. "Gran?" Stephanie asked with wide eyes. "What was she doing there?" asked Jasmine. "That is a very good question, Jasmine," said Dad. "Apparently, I found out afterwards, one of the parents who lived across the road from the school saw me lying next to the terrible red racer on the front lawn of the school. Noticing I had not moved for an extended period of time, they eventually rang my mum and said, 'Mrs. Burgess, is your son meant to be lying on the front lawn of the school at the moment, not moving?' Gran apparently said, 'Oh my goodness!' Mum started to giggle and then burst out laughing so hard she got tears in her eyes. 'Mum, you were ruining the story,' Jasmine said. 'Sorry,' Mum said, muffling her laughter. "Okay, where were we?" Dad asked. Getting the story back on track. Yes, Gran got the phone call. Based on that call, Gran got in the car and drove to school to see if I was actually lying down on the grass. As soon as Gran saw my arm, she knew immediately that it had been broken, as she had worked in an X-ray department and had seen lots of broken bones. She took me straight to the hospital that was closest to the school. "Unfortunately, that was when things started to go wrong," said Dad. "How could things have become any worse, Dad?" asked Stephanie as Mum wiped her eyes, still giggling. "Well," said Dad, now beginning to shake a little and wince at the thought of the next part of the story, Jasmine and Stephanie moved closer. "Matthew, finish the story, please," said Mum, stifling her giggles. "Okay," said Dad, waking himself up from his daydream. "Sorry, where were we up to?"
You had just arrived at the hospital, said Stephanie.
That is right, said Dad. I was checked into the emergency section of the hospital. We waited there for around 40 minutes, and eventually one of the doctors came along and asked, "Why are you here?" I showed the doctor my arm. He took my mum and I into a treatment room. Then he said, "That needs an X-ray. However, clearly the bone has been broken." Then he gave me a needle to numb the area to have it ready to be pulled back into place. The doctor asked my mum and me to go back to the emergency waiting area. We sat there for around 2 hours. During this time, I lost count of how many other people were helped. In fact, many of the people who were helped had arrived after us. Eventually, Gran went and asked one of the nurses when it would be my turn. Within a few minutes, another doctor came along and looked at my arm. We explained that the earlier doctor had confirmed that my arm would need to be pulled back into place and that I had been given a needle. The second doctor nodded and agreed with this. Then he took me into another treatment room. "Guess what happened then?" asked Dad. "What?" asked Jasmine as her eyes widened. The doctor asked a nurse to hold one end of my arm like this, while the doctor held my hand and wrist. Dad stood up and asked Jasmine to hold his hand while Stephanie held the top of his arm. "Now," said Dad, "on the count of 3, each of you pull in the opposite direction as hard as you can. 1, 2, 3, pull!" yelled Dad. Just as Stephanie and Jasmine pulled his arm, Dad screamed loudly, "Ah!" Stephanie and Jasmine fell to the ground, laughing. "Guess why I screamed?" asked Dad. "Because it hurt a lot," said Stephanie. "Yes," said Dad, "but it was not a normal kind of hurt. What we found out later was that the needle that I had been given numbed my arm for only 30 minutes. "But they had given you the needle over 2 hours earlier," said Stephanie, remembering the story. "Exactly," yelled Dad. This meant that there was nothing numbing my arm at all. Dad turned green at the thought. Mum giggled. Once the doctor had found this out, he said, "Why didn't you say so earlier? You will need to go to the big hospital at the other end of town where they give you a needle that puts you to sleep. Then they will fix your arm up." It was now almost night time, and Gran said, "You will have to go to the hospital by yourself. I need to go home to look after your sister and brother. I also need to help your dad as he is so sick he cannot get out of bed, and the builders have been working on the renovations today and sanded back the kitchen. Apparently there is an inch of dust in the kitchen. Plus, I have not even eaten today. Oh my goodness, what a mess this is." "Outrageous!" squealed Stephanie, and Dad nodded in agreement. Because Gran had to leave, it was agreed that there was only one way to get me to the hospital. Can you guess what that was? "How, Dad?" asked Jasmine, with a bright spark in her eyes. "Well," said Dad, "how do people get to a hospital in an emergency?" "In an ambulance!" screeched Stephanie. "An ambulance?" asked Jasmine, giggling. "Yes, an ambulance!" exclaimed Dad. "A real ambulance?" asked Jasmine with wide eyes. "Yes, Jasmine, a real ambulance," said Dad, smiling. "By the time I was put in the ambulance, it was night time, and the medical staff really looked after me," continued Dad. "When I got to the big hospital, the doctor and nurses there also looked after me really well. They explained exactly what was going to happen. They talked me through how I would go to sleep after they gave me 2 more needles. Then, while I was asleep, the doctor and nurses would put the bones in my arm back in place. Once the bones were back in place, a big plaster cast would go over my hand all the way up my forearm,
over my elbow and finish halfway up the top of my arm like this. Dad held his arm out in front of him with his elbow bent at a right angle to show exactly how his arm was going to look after everything had happened.
"And guess what?" asked Dad.
"What?" responded Jasmine, jumping slightly.
"Everything that the doctor and nurses told me was going to happen happened exactly as they promised. But there was one little thing that they forgot to mention. I remember to this day the event that was the worst part of all the events that day."
"Worse than actually breaking your arm, Dad?" asked Stephanie.
"Yes," said Dad in a lowered voice.
"Worse than the handlebars locking on the terrible red racer?" asked Jasmine.
"Yes," said Dad, lowering his voice further and moving closer to Jasmine and Stephanie.
"Worse than having your arm pulled back into shape without any anaesthetic?" asked Mum.
"Yes," said Dad, again lowering his voice and creeping closer.
"What was it?"
spluttered Stephanie, beginning to tremble. Dad paused again, increasing the tension, then whispered, "Guess where they put the last needle before I went to sleep? And before I tell you, keep in mind that it was this big." Dad held his hands about 30 centimetres apart and paused so Jasmine and Stephanie could imagine the very big needle. Then he exclaimed, "They put the needle right into my bare bottom!" "Ew!" screeched Stephanie, Jasmine and Mum in unison, and everyone rolled about laughing.